It is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Charles Fowler this evening. He's a friend. I met him over lunch on Star Island, maybe 8 years ago. And I was just fascinated by his perspective, which he has continued to refine and is going to share with us momentarily. But first, a bit of his background. Chuck left his family's farm in Nebraska, intending to become a Presbyterian minister. Disillusioned by the apparent detachment from reality in those courses, Chuck switched his majors to biology, chemistry, and math. His master's work in Alaska was followed by a summer in the jungles of Costa Rica. Chuck earned his PhD at the University of Washington, building a computer model of a small lake. And that work taught him that reality is infinitely more than our artificial models can capture. He later served as program leader at Seattle's National Marine Mammal Laboratory. He taught at 5 different universities, and he represented the United States on the North Pacific Fur Seal Commission and the International Whaling Commission. He became painfully aware of how often decision-making and management rely on incomplete, sort of inside-a-box thinking. Through the course of his research, over 150 publications, and formulating Fowler's rule, as well as interacting with colleagues and students, Chuck came to realize that other large mammals can serve as holistic role models for sustainability in human thinking and policymaking. So it's my pleasure to let Chuck Fowler take it away.
And welcome, everyone. I appreciate your taking time out of your busy lives to be here. This image of black-tailed prairie dogs helps make a very important point. Individuals are not a species. This may seem trivial, but the distinction is extremely important. This is a photograph of individuals, not a species. Much of what I have to say today involves species, with particular reference to the human species. Putting Humpty Dumpty together again. The substance of what I have to say has to do with thinking or epistemology and its role in managing to be a normal or sustainable species. This webinar is dedicated to Larry Hobbs. Larry, who died last year, introduced me to the works of Gregory Bateson, and he and I have served as co-authors in many of the papers that JD just referred to. In this presentation, I emphasize 2 main points. The first main point: we humans as a species are a pathogen or malignancy in the reality of which we are a part. Many of the ways we participate in reality are pathological. As you can see from this cartoon, I'm not the first to reach this conclusion. The second main point: the health, the healing that must take place requires that the laws of nature be allowed to do their work. Diseases are part of the biosphere's immune system. Can we accept their work as good news? This webinar is based on 4 primary cornerstones. Cornerstone number 1, a definition of reality. Reality is that from which nothing is excluded. With this definition, we see Humpty Dumpty as a whole made up of all of its parts. I did not put Humpty Dumpty together again. It was already together. Cornerstone number 2, a general principle. All things are interconnected. This is the 7th principle of Unitarian Universalism. It is recognized in a variety of other wisdom traditions. It also involves veracity. things are interconnected the way they are actually interconnected, not necessarily the way we imagine them to be interrelated. Cornerstone number 3, another general principle. What is good for the part can be detrimental to the whole, and vice versa. What is good for an individual may not be good for society. What is good for a person may not be good for their marital relationship. What is good for a species may not be good for the ecosystem. What is good for the biosphere may be lethal for the human species. Cornerstone number 4, one more general principle. Everything reflects everything else. Everything is accounted for in what we observe empirically. This involves the holism of normative information. More about that coming up. For now, think of Indra's net from Buddhism and Hinduism. These are the 4 postulates that constitute systemic thinking. However, a number of people have pointed out that we fail to think systemically, and many advocate a change in paradigm, a different way of thinking. This webinar is about systemic thinking, what Gregory Bateson considered fundamentally essential. Joe Meeker treated the ecological importance of Dante's epic poem, The Comedy. Nature has a fractal quality, individuals at one level, species another. Owing to the fractal nature of reality, we, as a species, can learn from our mistakes just as we do as individuals. A quotation by Joanna Macy relates to learning from the pain experienced by the mistakes we make. When we open to the pain of our world, we discover our interconnectedness with the web of life. This is the gift of dark and dangerous times, to find again our mutual belonging. As Joe Meeker says, misery arises from simplified and narrow vision. Felicity lies in participation in systemic complexity. In this webinar, I present examples of systemic thinking based on normative information. This way of thinking achieves universal holism. One of the key factors here is normative information. What is normative information? At the individual level, there are patterns, such as the pattern in our body temperature as it varies over the 24 hours of every day. Within this variation, there are limits. A body temperature of absolute 0 is neither sustainable nor normal. A body temperature of 101.3 degrees Fahrenheit would be considered a fever, abnormal, or outside the normal range of natural variation. We can ask a research question that aims us towards finding normative information. What is the normal noontime body temperature of an 85-year-old male human who weighs 185 pounds? We see when we conduct the research that body temperature is also related to age and sex. But abnormality is pathological. An important point here: we do not ask a team of experts or a blue ribbon panel for their opinions about what the body temperature should be. In 1851, German scientist Karl Wunderlich took the temperature of 25,000 people. This graph is an example of a histogram representing measurements of individuals. Later, we will see more histograms. but the measurements will involve species. Now let's talk about holism. How do naturally observed patterns achieve holism? As Thomas Berry put it, every being in the universe is universe referent for its origin and destiny and its proper role in the great community of existence. He also said, the wonderful thing about the universe is that it constitutes an absolute unity in which each component is universe referent and all the components are interreferent among themselves. In other words, every pattern, every part of reality is the result of everything that contributed to its being what it is. The infinite is involved. Everything in the universe has a story that excludes nothing, a history that excludes nothing. Everything, every part of reality embodies the full story, the infinite history behind its existence. All such stories are intertwined, an entanglement that subsumes quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement becomes simply almost a minor example of what I'm saying here. The title of Elizabeth Gilbert's book conveys the part of the concept of holism, the part of holism that I'm talking about here. Everything in the universe carries the signature of all parts of the universe that contributed to what it is and does, its essential nature. Albert Einstein said, God does not care about our mathematical difficulties. He integrates empirically. My colleagues and I use the term natural integration to refer to what spiritual traditions often refer to as immanence. But there is a very important point to be made here. This involves veracity. We are talking about the whole and complete truth. As you know, this is sadly missing in today's world. Let's look at this as illustrated graphically. As you can see in the graph, there is reciprocity. A pattern is a function of or becomes influenced by other patterns. Those other patterns contribute to the existence of the pattern of focus. And there are n such different sets of reciprocal interactions. And as that n goes to infinity, we start seeing the complexity of what we're talking about. We modify our graph to include more of the patterns to illustrate them as best possible, and it becomes very, very messy. If we keep going, we end up with a graph that covers the whole of everything we're looking at. The black image in front of you points to all of reality. Look around yourself and see the reality of which you are a part at this moment. Be aware of your existence in the universe and being a product of the universe. You, along with everything else, are a product of and part of reality. This includes every galaxy, every black hole, every microbe, every neutrino, and every natural force, from gravity to magnetism. It includes every butterfly that ever existed, and every butterfly effect over the entire history of the universe. This is true of every ecosystem and everything in each ecosystem, such as the Teton National Park with all of its coyotes, with all the grass, the bushes, the trees, and the mountains, and the stream. It holds true for every ecosystem and everything in each ecosystem, like Monument Valley with its sedimentary rocks, every drop of rain, and every creature that lives there. In 1991, Fritjof Capra and David Steindl-Rast published a book with the title Belonging to the Universe. In this book, Steindl-Rast has a quote: "The one reality to which we ultimately belong can be called God." If I use the term God, I am pointing to the essence of reality, that from which nothing is excluded. What do we do with this holism? As Thomas Berry said, every empirical observation of the world is our most valuable resource in establishing a viable mode of being for the human species. Gregory Bateson says, in talking about living systems or self-corrective circuits, we should follow the examples of the entities about which we are talking. Carl Jung said, nature is an incomparable guide if you know how to follow her. Systemic thinking leads to systemic management, and as a species, we can mimic the successes of the evolutionary processes carried out in reality, involving hundreds of thousands of years. We have the option of seeing other species of mammals of our body size as ecological role models. How do we do this? I will now present some examples, starting with harvesting biomass in the marine environment. At the outset, we ask a good management question that aims us towards normative information. If we are to participate in reality as a normal species of mammal of our body size, how much biomass would we harvest from the marine environment each year? Here we see a collection of 15 species of mammals of human body size with estimates of their amounts of the amount of biomass that they consume each year. The color coding identifies each species in the pie chart. When humans are included in this data, we see that our species overwhelms or outcompetes or dominates the others. Here we see these data in a histogram like we saw for human body temperature, along with humans as an outlier. The individual species are all color-coded as they were in the pie chart. Here we see the same histogram without the color coding except for humans. Well, there's an important way of looking at this information that involves measures of biodiversity. The biodiversity of this system of species, humans and the 15 marine mammals, can be measured with an equation represented by the curve in this curved line here. We have the option of maximizing diversity for this group of species by changing the rate at which we humans harvest biomass to maximize biodiversity. This is a set of pie charts like slides we will see for other metrics of participation in natural systems. A does not include humans, B does, C shows what it would look like if humans harvested at maximum diversity, and D shows the case in which humans harvest at a rate corresponding to the average for the other species. In this case, biomass consumption by humans in the marine environment was 185 times greater than the geometric mean, 61 times greater than the arithmetic mean, 35 times greater than what would have maximized biodiversity. Harvesting at rates corresponding to any one of these measures of central tendency would be like having a body temperature anywhere in the normal range of natural variation for that pattern at the individual level. These 16 species can be sampled 8 at a time to get 12,870 distinct combinations, half of which include humans. This example is one of those combinations that includes humans. The ecological impact of those thousands of combinations is not being dealt with in current forms of management, that is, in current forms of thinking. By harvesting at a normal rate, each group would have a normal influence on all things, and we humans would have a normal impact on each group. The harvest by humans in this case was 64 times larger than what it would have taken to move the histogram for those species, those groups with humans, to be equal to the histogram for those that involve the normative information. Part of what got me started thinking this way was my own research on northern fur seals. I realized that they were a species participating in the marine environment, and they serve as a role model for how to participate as a species. I realized that we could convert management from manipulation to participation. The last set of pie charts that I showed you apply to the full marine environment. We can look at the terrestrial environment in the same way. Global measures involve the full biosphere. Normative information can be generated for any part of the biosphere, an infinite set. This set of pie charts apply to the marine part of the biosphere. Again, A, humans not included, B, humans included, C at maximum diversity, and D, humans at the average for the other species. Systemic thinking and management can be applied to any of the infinite sets of ecosystems within the biosphere. Here we see data for the harvest of biomass from the eastern Bering Sea. Again, without humans, with humans, humans that maximize diversity, and humans harvesting at the rate corresponding to the average among the non-human species. With the same format, we see harvests from a group of species. Systemic thinking and management can be applied to the harvest from any group of species. Try to get your head around the number of combinations of species that occur in the biosphere. In this case, we have harvests from a group of species called the finfish of the eastern Bering Sea. Systemic thinking and management can be applied to the harvest of any one of the millions of individual species that exist. Here we have the harvest of pollock in the eastern Bering Sea, a single species of fish, again with the same format for the pie charts. So we have covered biomass harvesting from individual species, groups of species, ecosystems, and the marine environment, but biomass consumption is not the only metric that applies to species. If we were to participate in reality as a normal species of marine mammal, of a mammal of our body size, how much carbon dioxide would we produce each year? More and more people are concerned about our carbon dioxide production and how it might be causing problems. Think of climate change, ocean acidification, rising sea levels, the list goes on. But this gives rise to what we call a management question, as I just read. Scientists can get or reveal normative information from species like the Grant's gazelle. Here we see that the mean carbon dioxide production per individual is another metric that applies to species, and it is related to body size. The metric of carbon dioxide production per individual reminds us that there's no such thing as an average individual, but it's a metric that applies to species. And the species that we choose to compare ourselves with to get normative information are those species that are bounded by the vertical dashed lines as species of approximately human body size. Humans in the United States are all producing carbon dioxide at abnormal levels. Carbon dioxide production by the non-human species is so small when we look at it globally that in the pie chart, it is hardly visible at all. Carbon dioxide production by humans is about 3 million times greater than the average among the non-human species. There are 48 species in these species that provide normative information. We see ourselves as an outlier by orders of magnitude. Water consumption is another metric that applies to species. We have states and countries at odds with each other over water rights. If we were to participate in reality as a normal species of mammal of our body size, how much water would we consume each year? Water consumption is another species level metric that is correlated with body size. Here we have 8 cities in the United States and their per capita water consumption and showing its abnormal, its pathological nature in comparison to the other species of our body size. If we look at this at global, we see that global water consumption by humans is over 82,000 times more than the average for the non-human species. Again, in pie chart form, hardly visible, blown up to show the variability in that pie. Water consumption per unit area can be measured for any of the infinite areas of the Earth, any county, watershed, state, country, ecosystem, or the geographic range of any of the millions of species. Here we see water consumption for the 50 states in the United States, all showing the abnormality of human water consumption. Oxygen consumption is another way that species can be measured. Humans consume almost 2,900 times as much oxygen as is consumed by the average among the non-human species. In 1,000 years, current oxygen consumption could lead to about a third as much oxygen in the atmosphere as is there now. Global energy consumption is yet another dimension of being a species. Here again, the abnormality for humans is so extreme as to make the pie chart for the other species as a tiny, tiny dot encircled by another circle to show where it is. Humans consume about 154,000 times as much energy as the average non-human species of mammals of human body size. Energy consumption per unit area can be shown in a histogram. The bars in red represent 77 of the countries around the world where I could find information. Again, these kinds of measurements can be accomplished for any ecosystem, any watershed, any continent, any area of the Earth's surface. The human abnormality here involves several orders of magnitude. You are probably already painfully aware that many of the things I have talked about so far are connected to population. After all, the universe is an interconnected web of existence. The current human population is over 21,000 times larger than the average for the other species. Comparison to the mean among the other species makes use of one metric. The population that would maximize biodiversity is another metric. The current human population is about 3,600 times larger than what would maximize biodiversity. Total biomass for a species is yet another dimension of being a species. Here we have a larger sample of non-human species, so their pie is larger, and the slice in the larger pie is larger. But the current human biomass is about 2,180 times larger than the average for the other species. Here we see human abnormality for total biomass depicted in a histogram. Notice that the units of measure in each case is a portion of something. So this graph illustrates another really important point. The units of measure need to be the same for the good of normative information. If we apply the same units of measure to both humans and the other species, the pattern remains exactly the same. This pattern is the same whether it's represented by a portion of the total for the whole group, total for all the global biomass, total as a portion of the Earth, or for the portion of the solar system or portion of the universe. This remains unchanged as long as we use the same metric. Normative information also applies to other species, domestic species in particular. How large would the population of domestic cattle be if it were normal for a species of its body size? Cattle worldwide have a population that is about 13,000 times as much as the average for the non-cattle species. Swine worldwide have a population that is about 3,300 times as much as the average for the non-swine species. Note that as with body temperature, we are not seeking professional opinion, we are observing normative information. In 1995, Joel Cohen published estimates of the sustainable human population by dozens of experts. In this slide, we see a histogram showing these estimates. The average opinion had the sustainable population at about 55 billion. Compare this to the normative information. The bottom line is, don't ask experts, ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee. This applies to all dimensions of being a species. The Club of Rome, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the Marine Stewardship Council are all panels of experts. In no case that I am aware of are they seeing the wisdom of reality. They all rely on models and expert opinions with incomplete information. Population, the total global population is not the only metric involving population. There is also population density, or individuals per unit area. Population density is also represented by normal information. The average density of humans is over 1,600-fold larger than that for the non-human species. The density of humans in the United States is over 600-fold larger than the mean density of other species. This histogram represents a random sample of the densities of 1,000 combinations of 100 countries. If the sample size had been larger, the number of options would have been huge. In the sense of counties within the United States, there are over 2.4 times 10 to the 943rd distinct combinations of counties around the United States if we sample them half of the total at a time. This is orders of magnitude more than the current estimate of the number of elementary particles in the observable universe. It would take me many billions of years to show you the slides comparing each of these combinations to the normative information if I showed them to you at 1 slide per second. Domestic species are not confined to mammals. Other species, like birds, are included. Here we see chickens, ducks, and turkeys, along with dogs, cats, and other domestic species, and humans as well. All are quite abnormality in their global abundance compared to the normative information supplied by the birds and the mammals of the world. The field of macroecology has yet to fully embrace the concept that it is revealing normative patterns. A good example is the equivalence rule, a pattern of patterns. Here we see an example. For patterns involving the equivalence rule, species of mammals of all sizes count as part of the normative information. Here we see energy extraction per unit area. All agricultural practices involve ecological abnormality measured in orders of magnitude. Here we have the maximum for global energy extraction, which involves sugarcane. Here we have the minimum, which involve green peas. Scattered between those are the hundreds of different agricultural crops, exemplified by apples and oats in the United States. Agriculture is not the only field of human endeavor that has resulted in pathological impact by humans. Another example is the field of medicine. The total natural mortality rate is another metric that is related to body size, and all countries in the world show abnormally low natural mortality rates maintained by medical services. We see that abnormality in all the countries around the world. Here we see the results of abnormally low mortality rates, an increase in our population over time, correlated with an increase in the incidence of epidemics and pandemics. This is systemic feedback. There's an important point to be made here. We humans cannot operate under the pretext that we are exceptional or can exist independent of the laws of nature. Exceptionalism is one of the infinite things that are accounted for by the holism of what we observe. Exceptionalism is involved in what we see in our abnormality and its consequences. As a species, systemic thinking both avoids and accounts for exceptionalism. Our species is subject to all the laws of nature, as are all species. Again, exceptionalism is a part of reality that is accounted for by every empirically observed pattern. One final dimension, geographic range size. In mimicking other species, we have the option of occupying a certain portion of the earth and leaving the other portion unoccupied. There is a macroecological pattern in which the average portion of an ecosystem left unoccupied increases with ecosystem size. Our attempts to protect portions of these ecosystems falls far short of resulting in anything normal. 15% of the terrestrial environment and 7% of the marine environment. Totally abnormal. There are lots of other dimensions of species that we could consider. Energy consumption per unit area, the production of estrogenic compounds and pesticides. The list goes on and on. So, can we as a species achieve normalcy on our own? Maybe in things like setting quotas on fisheries management or harvest of trees, but not in reducing our population. It would be both abnormal to do so and impossible to do so equitably. In mimicking other species, we can depend on the self-organizing, autopoietic, self-perpetuating homeostatic forces of nature to be of holistic help. Can we see this as good news? Are we not immune to those forces? We are not immune to them. They can't be avoided. Our species is not an exception to being subject to the laws of nature. Exceptionalism is one of the factors that contributed to our pathological nature. I am on the lookout for people, publications, or quotes that exhibit an understanding that such events would be a good thing, that is, the effects of the homeostatic forces of nature. In his insightful poem, Earth's Desire, Thomas Berry says that one of the Earth's desires is to be endured in the severity of her discipline. Nietzsche says, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. Words that we usually use to characterize the impact of homeostatic forces include things like words like disaster, cataclysm, catastrophe, collapse, tragedy, and Armageddon, with a focus on the negative in the way we would experience them. But there's a silver lining to every cloud. What about the benefits for the other species, ecosystems in the biosphere, and humans in the long term? The third cornerstone of systemic thinking, as listed at the outset, was that what is to the benefit of the wholes can be detrimental to the parts. Again, as a species, can we come to see good news in the self-organizing forces of nature and their role in restoring humans to normalcy? As I said, I'm interested in learning about other quotations, works, and people who have recognized that there are good qualities to what we would experience as horrific. Please contact me if you have examples that come to mind that you think I might profit from learning about. Thank you. In any case, I have shown a sampling of normative information provided other species that gives us an idea of the order of magnitude of the problems that we face. As Thomas Berry said, we must be clear concerning the order of magnitude of the changes that are needed. Before closing, let's revisit holism. Number one, normative information accounts for everything. As I said before, systemic thinking is fully reflexive. Reuben Nelson, an IRAS member and one of the first presenters in this series, wants to see reflexivity in what we think and do. Part of the holism of systemic thinking involves thinking being a part of reality. If we change our thinking and actions, the systems with which we interact will change, and the resulting normative information takes into account what we have done along with the thinking involved. Systemic thinking is congruent with reality. With the melding of mind and nature, veracity is complete. We are dealing with the full truth when we think systemically and use normative information for guidance. In this veracity of systemic thinking, we see everything implicated in everything else. Natural patterns show order that carries the implications of everything that contributed. As conveyed in the title of David Boehm's book, everything is implicated in natural patterns. In systemic thinking, we see everything, including everyone, as an integral part of reality. This includes those that we deem to be evil, malicious, depraved, wicked, mendacious, and immoral. They are extreme in failing to think systemically, yet fully reflective of the infinite set of factors giving rise to their existence. Conventional thinking would have us take an interdisciplinary approach. It is an attempt to use experts rather than normative information. But all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put Humpty Dumpty together again. In systemic thinking, things become transdisciplinary in that reality is already a unified whole and nothing is ignored. The unknown and the unknowable are taken into account by normative information. This happens through what is known as immanence. You have undoubtedly heard of deep ecology. This is a big part of putting Humpty Dumpty together again, seeing that it is all one unified whole that includes the subjects of all disciplines yet to be realized. This involves deep history, deep thermodynamics, and deep cosmology. It includes deep mathematics and deep systems theory. From the point of view of deep mathematics, we see that the universe has a fractal quality. This fractal quality means that diversity, equity, and inclusion can be extended from our perspective involving individuals to our perspective involving other species. Diversity as maximized by being a normal species. Equity, as all species are emergent from reality. Inclusion, all species are parts of reality. This applies to all things. Everything is part of the grand system we call reality. This fractal quality also means that democracy can be extended to all things. Rather than destroy democracy, extend it. Every species would get a nonverbal vote in how to be a species. So, in the first point, this holism of normative information includes its complete reflexivity. We don't have to think of factors that need to be taken into account. Normative information does it for us. The second point is, if our species were normal in all dimensions, justice would be served to all things. Everything in the cosmos would be relieved of any impact of human abnormality, direct or indirect. The rights of all things to be free of human impact, abnormal human impact, would be fully respected and honored. Third, all combinations of humans would be united.
This is the take-home message of my 2021 Zygon paper, The Convergence of Science and Religion. Democracy would be expanded to all species with input from all reality. All world leaders would be on the same page. Every Elizabeth Colbert, every Rachel Maddow would think the same way. Every Bill McKibben and every religious world leader would join in emphasizing the importance of human normalcy and the veracity of normative information. Every Ken Wilber, along with every ecologist and every university professor, would hold the common understanding that reality is a guiding force. Every pope, every Dalai Lama, every president of the United States would think systemically. Every group of people, every combination of humans the world over would share the systemic perspective. This is my fantasy for our species. Now, some of you may be reacting with thoughts like, Chuck Fowler is a real dreamer. Yes, like Martin Luther King, I have a dream. As King said, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And I am fully aware that our genetically determined nature may prevent this from happening and lead to our extinction. Fourth, achieving holism requires being normal in all dimensions of being a species. The one caveat to what I have presented so far is that we remain stuck with human limitations in not being able to think of all dimensions of being a species. However, if we can invite the help of Mother Nature in regaining normalcy, most dimensions of being a species will be restored to normalcy. In the paper I am proposing for this year's IRAS conference, I will develop the point that if we become a normal species, the mental health of individuals would be restored and systemic thinking would be self-perpetuating. Acknowledgements are important. The work I have talked about would not have been possible without people like Larry Hobbs, to whom I've dedicated this presentation. Larry's role in my life included bringing Gregory Bates into my realm. He was married to Margaret Mead, so indirectly that impacts me as well. It's part of my belief system. Fred Lamphere injected the work of Thomas Berry into my life. Following Fred's passing in 2010, a group of colleagues began a Thomas Berry study group, which lasts to this day. Thomas Berry had very extensive connections with the philosophers and theologians of the world. His numerous publications included the influence of many of these people and theologians, all now part of my life and my thinking. I thank all of the interns, students, employees, supervisors, and co-workers that I have had the good fortune to work with over the years. People like Megan Rodden helped extract information from the published literature. She, I, and our colleagues are all very grateful to the thousands of scientists who produced the data used in our publications and in this webinar. There are no words to adequately express my gratitude to my wife, Jean, for all of her endurance, help, and support over the years of my working through the concept of systemic thinking. I hold special gratitude in my heart for J.D. Stillwater and his support in making this webinar happen. And I thank Bonnie Nadzem for her services as respondent, services we have yet to see and are about to witness. And thanks to you for attending this webinar. I hope that my influence on your life has nudged the world toward the systemic paradigm. Thank you.
Chuck, thank you. Beautiful. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Bonnie has to say. I was privileged to meet Bonnie Nadzem at the IRAS conference in June of 2023, and I was blown away by her talk, which really was more an inward journey of mindfulness than a lecture. Bonnie is an American writer and Zen Buddhist priest and chaplain. Her poetry, essays, and fiction have appeared in Harper's, Orion Magazine, the Iowa Review, Kenyon Review, many other journals and magazines. Her first novel, Lamb, won prestigious awards and was translated into several languages, and not too long ago became an award-winning independent film. Her second novel, Lions, also won awards, and she co-authored Love in the Anthropocene, which has been in my Amazon cart for quite a while, and I did not know that it had a connection to Bonnie. She co-authored that with environmental ethicist Dale Jamieson. Bonnie holds a BA from Carleton College, an MFA from Arizona State University, and an MA and PhD from the University of Southern California. She's currently a research fellow with the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. I had to read that a couple times. Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. Bonnie is going to share her response to Chuck's presentation. So I will now turn it over to Bonnie, and Chuck and I will stop our videos.
Thank you so much, JD. It's really good to see you again and to be among all of you IRAS lights. They're such full days working and raising little ones, but we all do very much want to and intend to come back to Star Island, which of course one does. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to engage with all of you, and with you, Chuck, especially. You and your work tonight are just singular and ambitious and inspiring. The paper that I read in preparation and your presentation tonight are so amazingly dense and rich. There's so much I could respond to. So many sentences capture my imagination and merit an entire paper of its own. For the sake of time, of course, I'm going to zoom in on one moment of human experience as Chuck describes it: the observation and perception of immanence in things and the normative patterns they reflect. It is this moment upon which change, as Chuck would hope to see it, seems to depend. A person would experience and observe the immanence in things, be guided by what is knowable and unknowable thereby, and how this observation experience resonates with other experiences, until eventually, responding with sensitivity, perhaps especially to that which is unknowable and immeasurable, a human or a group of humans creates a holistic map to guide them, to help navigate times like these. So let's pause on immanence. Chuck's description and definition bring to mind the notion of seeing the entire moon in a dewdrop. Perhaps this is familiar to some of you. This is from Zen Master Eihei Dogen's 1233 Genjo Koan, which is a fundamental and really beautiful and concise Zen text. It's like 3 pages long, and you'll never digest it. It's just amazing. And in it, in this little passage I'm going to read from it, Dogen is describing how ultimate reality, very much the way that Chuck defines it, can be reflected and realized by a person, even with limited human capabilities and functions. So here's the little passage from the Genjo Koan about seeing the entire moon in a single dewdrop. Enlightenment is like the moon reflected on water. The moon does not get wet, nor is the water broken. Although its light is wide and great, the moon is reflected even in a puddle an inch wide. The whole moon and the entire sky are reflected in dewdrops on the grass, or even in one drop of water. The depth of the drop is the height of the moon. Each reflection, however long or short its duration, manifests the vastness of the dewdrop and realizes the limitlessness of the moonlight in the sky. So everything in the universe, everything, as Chuck said, every atom, every emotion, every archaeological ruin, every fascist movement, every brave deed, every house and tree is part of one seamless reality. And when perceived directly, even for a split second, which is not to say when understood, but when perceived directly, it is numinous and it instructs us. Most of us have had experiences like these of sensing the imminence of a tree, of a wild animal, even something like a teaspoon when the morning light is just hitting it, just so. It can give you a sense of wonder, or say, the heart of a child. When we have these experiences, we are not having them with our rational minds. These are spiritual experiences. And in some traditions, we are cautioned against reifying them or turning the experience into a thing that we can be proud of, or that dazzles us, or that we might, if we try really hard, repeat or explain or understand or map. But we can't map it. Personally experiencing this lends itself to a sense of being liberated from the delusion of separateness of the individual self, of being neither the part nor the whole, but simultaneously both part and whole. Moon in a dewdrop, universe in a kind word, all of seamless reality in a single open hand of Humpty Dumpty, say, holy himself and well. To make a map of the world without any such experiences factored into it is to miss like practically everything in my view, and maybe in Chuck's as well. To pivot just a little bit, I'm also deeply intrigued by the idea of non-human mammalian species serving as a role model for humans, of non-human species embodying a completely ordinary and non-pathological way of being in the world. I've recently completed a thesis for the Upaya Zen Center's chaplaincy program, and its focus is animal chaplaincy. This is an emerging area of chaplaincy, and in the mainstream, it seems to be emerging as something like ceremonies for animal companions who have died, for example, a beloved dog, or for example, spiritual care for animal activists who are burnt out, or veterinarians who have a very high suicide rate, which I didn't know before this research. Or slaughterhouse workers, just to name a few examples of people in the field who need spiritual care. But my experiences over the years of the program led me to understand animal chaplaincy as something quite different that I think is aligned with what Chuck is getting at. I came to see and appreciate the animals as chaplains. When I'm sitting in meditation in the early morning, the songbirds begin their chaplaincy rounds just about the time the sun is coming up. The stink bugs around the house, the cat in the chair, the voles nesting under the porch are all embodying the supremely attentive, supremely alive way of being that we too as humans can touch when we can still and slow down our discursive minds and realize that the map can never be represented completely by what is scientifically measurable. There is so much more to being a human. It is actually quite a radical thing to propose that non-human species are our spiritual equals. But I propose it. I say it is so. It may be pushing a little further in one area of Chuck's paper than he goes, but okay, now I've gone there. Non-human species are our spiritual equals. And I think that that has implications most of us are not quite prepared to accept. What Chuck in his paper calls abnormal and abnormal species is not only pathological in terms of resource exploitation, CO2 production, etc., but perhaps more fundamentally pathological because we humans, at least in mainstream Western culture, have lost a way of being that was as much our birthright as it is the birthright of non-human animals. When the passerine outside my window are flying and lighting on tree branches, that is all they are doing. They are doing it wholly, fully, and completely, just flying. In one of my first encounters with a Zen teacher, meeting face-to-face in what's called a dokusan, or a personal interview, I was really intimidated. I didn't have any questions for him, and I didn't really even have a sense or an understanding of what kind of question I was supposed to be bringing or I was supposed to have. His name was Daishin, and he had just given us a Dharma talk on what in Japanese is called shikantaza. A good translation is just sitting, nothing extra, wholehearted, embodied sitting, like those seals on the rocks. Breath moving in and out of a little swinging door in the throat. Breath moving as if of its own accord. Breathing is happening, just breathing. So I'm in this face-to-face interview with my first Zen teacher, and I have nothing to say. It's about 7 p.m. on a Wednesday in Southern California. And outside on Hill Street in Santa Monica, right outside the window of where I'm sitting with Daishin, there's this baby screaming. You know the sound of a screaming baby, just howling away, hungry or tired or angry or all three. It's such a particular and terrible sound. And Daishin, this wonderful old teacher of mine, in response to my silence before him, says to me, "What is that baby outside doing?" I stared at him a little stupidly, and I don't know. I could have given so many true responses, but I said, I don't know. I didn't trust the normative information. And Daishin said, "Just crying." And he rang his little bell to dismiss me from the room. So much in your paper, Chuck, seems to hinge upon a human's capacity for perceiving imminence, for perceiving the moon in a dewdrop. And yes, this is part of normative information we can gain simply by observing. It is readily available to us. Nothing is hidden. But seeing the moon in a dewdrop, or the patterns of the universe and seamless reality, and a healthy, fulsome Humpty Dumpty in the glinting light of a teaspoon, this has little to do with what is scientifically measurable. So here's my question. Why do we seem so resistant to using normative information like this in our map making to help us navigate life as humans on planet Earth? Why are we so resistant to taking seriously what we can readily observe and experience, but only describe incompletely, and certainly not quantitatively? Why do we privilege what we call logical or rational, but only insofar as it serves our personal individual needs? For clearly Chuck is correct in his observation that what we think is good for each of us individually, lots of water, say, or other resources, is not so good for the lot of us. Finally, I think Chuck is onto some pretty sensitive and accurate ground also when he narrows in just for a moment, more so in the paper than in the presentation, on Western medicine and how much each of us wants to live, not only with lots of water and lots of space and lots of food, but also long. We want to live well and we want to live long. If I, Bonnie, am just this individual person, then death is really a total, complete destruction. So if this is my view, I will tend to see mortality not as something that gives my life meaning, but as something to overcome, and for as long as possible. I would be seeing death not as the last amen of one set of conditions and the first of another, but as the end, not a transition, not a rite of passage, not a sacred threshold, but the end, full stop. When we look at ourselves in the mirror, we don't usually see our own imminence. We don't usually experience the entire seamless reality looking back at us through a single pair of human eyes, we see a very important person, one person, who seems to stand alone, independently, and who has a limited number of days to be themselves. What ordinary Western lives seem to be lacking, according to Chuck's assessment, is meaningful community and a meaningful awareness of and relationship with death. In the paper, he has this wonderful line that he gestured to at the end of the presentation, asking whether we have to experience the trauma of self-corrective homeostasis repeatedly, or whether we can wake up and change, be normal, be ordinary, sit on the rocks, reclaim somehow that birthright that the animals know, but that we seem to have forgotten. And if you ever look a wild animal in the eye, even like the single shining black eye of a squirrel in a tree, you get the feeling, you know it, that they remember something we've lost. They're holding something we've lost. How can we help each other remember what it is? How can we reclaim and experience it again as if for the first time? These are the questions that Chuck's paper raises for me. And I'm so grateful to you, Chuck, for raising them and for doing such an enormous amount of synthesis. I mean, they're like, talk about moon in a dewdrop. Your paper is the embodiment of it. It really is. I'm humbled by it. I'm grateful for it, and so interested to see what kinds of questions are arising now.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. My overall reaction is one of I struck gold when I tapped you for the role of serving as respondent in this webinar. You hit a bullseye. I'm so impressed with what you had to say. So thank you. My gratitude right up front. And one of the things that your comments included was your reading of the moon and the dewdrop. And it just reminds me of something that you mentioned in your book, Love in the Anthropocene, is how language is so, the way I often put it, is so puny in really communicating the essence of what we're trying to get at here. And while you were reading the poem, I was extending the concept to how the moon moves the ocean, and the moon and its gravity and everything is reflected in the tidal cycles along with that of the sun, of course. But the moon is part of our reality. It is reflected in our existence and in the existence of that drop of water in that poem. And I'm reminded of my comment about using deep ecology extended to deep other ways of thinking, other disciplines. We often discount astrology as something that's really pretty inconsequential. But just think of all of the, if we really think of deep astrology, we have to recognize that there are an infinite set of butterfly effects involved in the impact of planets and the rocks circling around Saturn. These all have their influences on us, and quantum entanglement, as the physicists are pointing out, involves an involvement of all of these things. The unity of reality is just plain phenomenal. Then one of your questions, and I may not get to all of them because I may not remember them all, but one of your questions had to do with, why do we do what we do? Why are we not thinking that way? What's standing in the road? And here we get to what I want to say is another need to have a deep appreciation of what Richard Dawkins had to say in his book, The Selfish Gene, which was very controversial. But nevertheless, we really have to recognize that our genetic nature is something that we have to live with. The heritage of all of my parents, the heritage of all of evolution, has been a evolutionary process in which I, as an example, emerge as somebody who fears death and does not want to die. I join you in not wanting to die. And one thing that I extend from that kind of thinking is that involves a quote by Brian Klaus from the Atlantic. We control nothing and we influence everything. And I look at my influence and the influence of this webinar, for example, as something like dropping a rock in a pool of water that will have its ripple effects. And as I said in one of my last two slides or so, I hope that the ripple effect of what I've had to say will ripple throughout the universe. And I firmly believe that it will happen, whether I like it or not, or whether I like the consequences or not. But I look at my life as having, I'll call it an immortality or a life after death, in that I can't stop those ripple effects. They go on and on and on. I probably have taken up enough time here in an initial reaction to your thoughts. And again, I thank you for them. I'm just sat here in awe of how you put in words so much of what I had to say. So thank you. And what I guess I would do, if unless JD has an alternative thought here, is turn it back to you again, Bonnie, and ask you, with what I've said and with things that you said, did I succeed in addressing or fail? What kinds of things did I fail in addressing in your comments? But for which I'm super, super thankful. So are there things that you would like to hear me address again?
No, thank you so much. That I really appreciate you saying that you join, the rest of us in wanting to live a long life and not die. It's something about being both part and whole. It's this strange package that we show up as. And there's more in your paper, I think, than was in your presentation about our thinking minds and how they might be an obstacle. And if we were to continue the conversation offline, and maybe we will, I would want to go there more. But it looks like we have a ton of questions too. So let's see what other folks have to say.
Yeah, well, just in immediate reaction to that, another element of the reasons why we don't think systemically have to do with what I'll call cultural aspects of our existence. And our educational system is one that has its own homeostatic properties, maintaining a focus on thinking the way we think now, rather than thinking systemically. And expanding that thinking, as I try to point out in that paper, is one in which educational systems would really not stop educating people, but we don't want to demolish I don't want to demolish the educational department of the United States, the Department of Education. I would like to see the education expanded to include training and learning about systemic thinking. It's part of what I think would be a major step forward. Anyway, JD, maybe we could turn it over to you. I don't know.
There are a lot of questions, and I'm a little flummoxed in trying to figure out where to begin. I want to start with one that is really very sort of concrete. Anonymous person asks, in what sense is nature normative when the biodiversity and species composition and ecology of Earth have varied so much over the billions of years of Earth's history, even before humans came into being? Which period is the baseline for considering normal, and why?
Extremely good question. I really appreciate it. And in the complexity of things, change happens. And the way I look at the normative information from the other species is that they reflect the way things are in a temporal field that makes it so that they are telling us, as Thomas Berry would put it, every being has voice. They're telling us what is workable now, what's functional now. And if an asteroid hits the Earth, then that changes everything. Well, then what happens after that is an expression of the influence of that asteroid. And so we, as Elizabeth Colbert points out, we're involved in the sixth mass extinction. I mean, she's just summarizing things that a lot of people have been pointing out. And part of the reflexivity that Ruben Nelson is looking for here has to do not only with being reflexive and responding to our own thinking that would change things, but to changes that happen in the environment, so that when a new form of climate comes along that has nothing to do with us, or if that's the case, then what we would see would reflect what works under those circumstances.
Yeah, since you mentioned Ruben, I'm going to go to his question next. He asks, first he's great, expresses gratitude, and he says, how do you account for the present inability of humans in modern cultures, all modern cultures, question mark, to see, experience, think, and respond systemically? Some see biological inhibitions, some cultural. Where do you pin the blame, so to speak, on our seeming inability?
Sure. Well, and part of what I think he is aware of and getting at here, or brings to that question, has to do with the history of cultures around the world, many of which are human. Well, I'm talking about human cultures now. And in the current way of thinking, people often look at the Aboriginal cultures around the world and say, they have really a lot to tell us, the cultures of Colombia that are actually speaking out. And what we have to recognize is that in all cases, we're still dealing with human cultures. So we really need to go back in terms of time, several thousand years, to find human cultures and human populations and human existence to be anything that's within the normal range of natural variability for species of our body size. But the point I'm trying to underline here is that we really need to be cautious about turning to Aboriginal worldviews and saying that they've got it all, because they're still human. And so they still bring human qualities and genetic natures to their decision making. The people of Colombia who are telling the Western world that we're screwing up themselves have a population level that is beyond a sustainable density. It's one of those things where we really have to, if somebody approaches me and starts criticizing what I have to say and gives me an idea of something else, I'm going to say something to the effect of, okay, what I realize is I'm listening to a human. I'm not taking the information from the other species.
I think this one is actually related. Paula asks, there are undoubtedly examples of other species that have overpopulated and experienced crashes from natural effects. Are there lessons there that can inform us as to what point human population size is likely to experience a similar crash or even extinction?
Right. I don't know who the Paula is, but I'm guessing it might be Paula White, a friend of mine. If it is, thank you, Paula. But thank you, Paula, in any case. Yeah, over the history of studying populations, and population dynamics was one of the fields of interest to me, and the topic of one of my books. The populations undergo natural change, and they have a boom and bust cycle that is observed. And in all cases, if they overpopulate the environment that they occupy, they come back down to those levels that are sustainable. It's an empirical sustainability, a way in which the changes in the natural dynamics of the ecosystem are reflected in where they end up. And so, if the Club of Rome were to take the systemic approach, they would really recognize that their models are like my model of Fern Lake. It's not reality, it's a model. And they would turn to looking to the normative information of other species and take into account that within that range of variability, there's a lot of variability. And when other species get outside that, they themselves are brought back into the fold by all those homeostatic and self-organizing forces. It's just natural for it to be that way.
We are almost out of time, and there are so many good questions remaining here. Barbara Whitaker-Johns is thinking about this coming summer's conference, which she's a co-chair of. She says, a metaphysical question embedded in the conference relates to your theme, Chuck. We'll explore research suggesting that humans have a, quote, spiritual core that can be accessed to the benefit of individuals and communities, that can be accounted for by evolutionary processes. But does the evolution of this core reflect everything else, as you indicated? Can we take our experience of the opening of this core for, lack of a better word, a spiritual awakening? Can we take our experience of that as reflective of the nature of reality itself? She says, I think so, but not everyone does.
Yeah, well, if I understand the question correctly, and I think I do, I would agree with her 100%. And the reason I'm saying that is, for me, we all have that within us. And that's one of the reasons that I said in my presentation that I may be dreaming, but my dream is based on an assumption, maybe I'll call it, or the premise that I think she's bringing up here, is that I think we all have that within us. And one of the things that happened for me in teaching my course at Seattle University was having students come to the realization that they themselves have this divine quality, this numinous quality. And once they understand that for themselves, then through a process of projection, they can relate to both other creatures and especially raise it to the level of species. So I think those things, well, the way Gregory Bateson put it, when you really get right down to it, every schoolboy knows this stuff. You just have to tap into it.
We really are out of time, but I want to just squeeze in one more that I think it's a simple question, but it gets at something much deeper. This anonymous person says, given your points about how everything is so amazingly interconnected, why is it that something can be good for the part, but bad for the whole?
That's also a great question, and it would probably be worth a book or something like that in terms of developing an answer. But yeah, the interconnected nature of reality involves all of the parts, and all of those parts fit into this holonic kind of structure, so that individuals are parts of species, and species are parts of ecosystems. And JD, I think you in your tapping into or pointing to that, used the example of Russian dolls, that things within. And these occur at all different layers. It involves the mathematical realization that reality has a fractal nature, and so I drew up on that a bit in my presentation. But yeah, it's part of a realization that reality isn't just a heap of things, all of which have their own agency, but that those things also fall into categories like individuals and species and ecosystems and galaxies and clusters of galaxies and so forth.
Yeah, and I think you partly answered that question when you used the analogy of cancer. What's good for a cancer cell? There are things that are really good for cancer cells that are bad for the whole body. So.
Yeah. Well, and when you think about our physiology, blood is essential to the brain. And yet, if the brain is exposed to blood directly, it gets killed.
Yeah. All right. We're going to have to end it there because we really are out of time. So
thank you, JD. I really appreciate it.
Deep gratitude to you and to Dr. Nadzim.